I think the idea that children believe something because we told them, like, is probably not accurate. I don't think you have a Christian kid because you've gotten them to recite the right stuff. Our relationship with God is an internal spiritual orientation that involves our like whole being, our will and our mind and our heart and our emotions, everything. I think it's more important for them to understand the process of how I arrived at my belief and to have a process for evaluating other people's conclusions. Number one, it's problematic if parents think that getting their kids to repeat the things means they've raised Christian children. I don't think that's the kind of faith that lasts when there's adversity, when there's doubt, when there's struggle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. On the topic of teaching children, should we indoctrinate children on things we believe? When, why, and how should we teach children? Christy, how are you doing today?
Good. It's
Awesome.
hot here, but other than that, I'm doing awesome.
Yeah, so you have an interesting background with homeschooling and parenting and all that, as well as what you do for work. So could you talk about like a little bit of your background? Could you talk about just like, what it was like growing up, what you learned and all that other stuff?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was a child of evangelicalism. I was raised in a Christian home in a Baptist church. And, from the time I was very little, my parents were very devout, good Christian people. And I was actually homeschooled until 6th grade myself, like before it was a thing in the 80s. And even then, most of the Christian produced material was very anti-science and had a very fundamentalist, it came out of the fundamentalist kind of stream of the Christian church. Now, my parents were not fundamentalists, and we used some material that they were kind of like, we're not on the same page with all this stuff. And my dad was actually a public school teacher and, got some materials from his school, but just normal secular educational materials that we also used. So my homeschooling was probably different than, some other people who were like fully engaged in the Christian homeschooling world. But I did not intend to homeschool my children. I was actually a public school teacher myself. I do not have all these huge issues with public education. There are good schools and bad schools, and there are great teachers and, bad teachers. You can't just lump them all into one or the other. There are lots of public school teachers in my family. I really appreciate the hard work that they do. And just, I feel like teachers are an amazing contributors to our society, and we should respect them more than they sometimes get these days in the conversations that swirl around education. But 10 years ago, my husband and I moved to rural Mexico to work with a development organization. And I had my youngest was 4 and my oldest was in 2nd grade. And so I realized that the only educational option for them would be for me to homeschool them, and probably through high school. And this was, I sort of had assumed there'd be some school for them to go to, but I became a homeschooler, not because of conviction so much as necessity, but because I was homeschooling and I needed to pick curriculum, and I needed to, even having a background as a high school teacher, I didn't know how to teach kids how to read, and I didn't know, I'd never done elementary school. So there was still a learning curve for me. And I got involved with different homeschooling communities, online, just interacting with other homeschooling parents, and kind of got a feel going to conferences and book fairs for what people are using and what kind of ideas are dominating. And then through my involvement with BioLogos, it's a faith and science organization promoting, acceptance of rigorous science in churches, and just that we should trust Christian scientists among us and hold them up as role models, not as people who have sold out to the devil. And so I got involved with them, and they had been hearing from a lot of parents who were homeschooling that there just really wasn't anything on the market that started with the presupposition that science is reliable. The scientific method gives us truth about the world. And as Christians, when that, the discoveries of science challenge our beliefs, we need to find a way to harmonize that, because all truth is God's truth. It's not It's not that we need to oppose science because it's telling us something different than God tells us. We need to assume that God speaks through his world and God speaks through his word, and we just need to hear him right. And so I got involved in a writing project developing a high school curriculum for Christian schools and homeschoolers. It is not a science curriculum in that it doesn't teach like all the basics of biology, but it's designed to be used by biology teachers alongside their regular science curriculum to really bring out issues in biology, in modern science and technology that pose specific challenges for us, like either theologically or ethically, and to kind of guide conversations from a Christian worldview about, okay, what does the science say? And then how do we as Christians like integrate this with our Christian worldview, our understanding of what the Bible says about who we are as Christians in this world. So that's sort of an orientation to me and homeschooling and science and faith.
Yeah, so you briefly mentioned how, you're kind of looking at different curriculums and you're like trying to choose what's best for your children and all that. And you realize that, not a lot of them, well, a lot of them were, I guess, like more fundamentalist based. I don't, well, you said when you were a child, maybe not so much now. I don't know.
Oh no, it's still dominant because I think the kind of the groups that have been publishing for many years have been more fundamentalist or very conservative evangelical. I feel like the lines have gotten blurred over the last so a lot of the homeschooling material that even people that are not necessarily from that stream of Christianity are using, it has they call like providentialist history. So that God intended for white people to like have America and set it up as a city on a hill and like the new Israel for, the benefit of the nations. And so like super centering of white Europeans and pretty denigrating of Native Americans. And there's like some really popular homeschooling curriculum is written by a slavery apologist. It's problematic for some people. And then from the science end, if you have a textbook that advertises itself as having a Christian perspective on science, almost 100% of the time, that means it presents young Earth, flood geology, Usher's chronology, which, they'll give a history curriculum and you won't even know that it's like young Earth, but it'll change the dates of ancient Egypt to match like the flood happened in, 3000 whatever BC. And so therefore the pyramids had to be built after. And most homeschooling curriculum, like in order to be published and in order to be sold at homeschooling conventions, you have to present it from this young Earth perspective, from this patriotic perspective, which is, like lost cause thing for the Civil War and just some stuff that I think as younger, as millennials, and now it's even Gen Y is starting to have young children and starting to homeschool, you have a lot of Christians who are like, this is not okay. Like, we need better stuff. And so more now is being offered kind of from like a different side of more progressive kind of evangelicalism or Christian view. But up until, fairly recently, dominating was the pretty fundamentalist, reformed idea of this is what Christians believe.
Right. Yeah. So I'd say, I grew up homeschooled. I did Bob Jones. At the same time, I don't remember a whole lot about what I learned and all that. So I can't verify if Bob Jones was any of that you described, really.
Well, sometimes it's not what they teach you, it's what they leave out. So yeah. There's a Christian publishing company that got a major UK publisher of secular educational. They reissued Encyclopedia of World History with the first 80 pages that dealt with prehistory and the dinosaurs and cavemen and all that. They just took it out and they reissued it as starting with agriculture because that fit the homeschoolers' worldview. And then they reissued a bunch of other textbooks. They changed all references to millions or billions of years to a long time ago and republished this special Christian homeschooler edition of a totally secular book. So some of it is a lot of Christian curriculum, even if they're not proactively teaching a young Earth view, they are not addressing climate change. They are not addressing evolution. They are not addressing an ancient Earth. They are not addressing even like what archaeologists would say is the normal understanding of human history, because it doesn't fit into the timeline.
Right, and of course, there's a lot of debate about that. So I'd be really interested to know specifically like Egyptian chronology, because I mean, you're pushing a lot, and I don't even know if I remember studying it that much. So maybe it just wasn't a big influence. Like, oh, we're just not going to talk about that. I can't even
Well,
remember.
honestly, who remembers the dates you learned in history class anyway? So
Yeah.
it probably just went over your head.
Yeah, I can't give you a good analysis of how much I paid attention or not. So you mentioned it's kind of like a lot of the issues with a lot of homeschool curriculums these days. Like, how would you say your curriculum addresses that?
The Biologos curriculum?
Yeah.
Well, like I said, it's the only thing on the market that is trying to say we accept consensus science as a starting point, and we are from there trying to hold out Christian role models and think about how do we respond Christianly to the issues that science raises. One thing that I think Christianity should focus on orthodoxy and orthopraxy and orthopathos. So you got three orthos. So orthodoxy is right beliefs. And I think we do a good job with this in our education. We are always, trying to solidify what is it that are the right beliefs that we can teach kids. And that's important. It's important to teach them what Christians believe and what the Bible says. But it's also, orthopraxy is, what is the right action to take? As Christians, what do we do? And so our curriculum says, okay, if climate change is negatively impacting the most vulnerable people in the world and is disparate, like the disparities between the way it's affecting poor and marginalized are enormous. How as Christians what do we do about this? What's the Christian action to take? When we see people with disabilities being marginalized in our society, what do we do? And so we are concerned about talking about like orthopraxy to go with our orthodoxy. And then there's another one you don't hear about as much that I read about fairly recently, and I really love this idea of orthopathos. So that is having the virtuous response. So our affective, our feeling response is coming from a Christ-like character. So when we see suffering, we feel compassion. And when we see injustice, we feel anger. And when we see beauty and just the majesty of creation, we feel awe and wonder are pushed to it. And when we receive generosity, we feel gratitude. So our curriculum, every unit focuses on a Christian virtue that we're trying to build in our lives and have the right Christian response in these situations where we also need to believe the right things and we also need to do the right things. But we need to respond with Christian virtue as well. So I think that is something that sets it apart, is most curriculum is only focusing on telling people what to think and not necessarily opening up conversations about what do we do and how do we feel about the issues.
Yeah, of course. So a big controversy over parenting and schooling is, people are afraid of indoctrination, maybe not so much among like conservative Christians, but definitely around, I've heard a lot like, oh, you indoctrinate your children on Christianity. You tell them what to believe. Do you have any thoughts on that, on the issue? Like, do you think we should be indoctrinating children?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and I've actually thought a decent amount about it. And I think there's fear on both sides. So I think if you watch the news, you have people like Christians irately storming school boards because they're convinced that the public schools are indoctrinating their children with CRT, with teaching them to be transgender or gay, or there is this concern that public schools indoctrinate. And then there's definitely a concern that Christian homeschoolers are withholding important information from their children and only presenting a certain worldview that indoctrinates kind of their children in a way that is not palatable to the wider culture. So I think that the fear goes both ways. And I think the word indoctrination, like, it's a pejorative word, right? It like, doctrine is a positive word. Doctrine is a belief, a foundational belief. But indoctrinate kind of has this connotation of make people believe propaganda. And in an unthinking way, like in an uncritical, just accepting way, make them like be able to parrot the party line. And so I think that as parents, we want to enculturate our children, and as schools, like, there's also enculturation that goes on, and this is a normal thing that children in societies will learn what the society values, how to behave like a good person in that society, how to treat other people in ways that will be viewed as like respectful and honorable in that society, how to avoid being shameful. Like, we need to enculturate our children. And I think the problem comes when you have certain Christian communities who are like, they're a little dysfunctional and they're very set apart from the wider culture. And so they have just like incredibly different ideas of what we're enculturating children into. And the enculturation that's happening in some Christian homes maybe is not preparing those children to function as encultured members of the wider society. And vice versa, there are some Christian parents who feel like the enculturation happening in schools is not preparing them to function in their Christian community. And so just the disconnect between the two, I think, is the issue people are responding to. But I don't think that there's this ideal where parents would not enculturate their children and would just like say, we don't know what you should believe. You know, you need to examine everything for yourself and decide when you're old enough what you think. And we're never going to tell you what we think you should think or what we think is right. That doesn't happen. That's not how humans raise children. It just doesn't happen that way.
It doesn't happen, or are you saying that it can't?
I don't think it can. I think that you will absorb a worldview as a child growing up.
Mhm.
Like, you will have experiences, you will get responses from people that either validate or don't validate your perceptions of the world, and you will learn how to behave. And so no matter how neutral parents think they are being, they are communicating values. They're communicating what behavior is good and acceptable and what behavior is bad and unacceptable. And their children are absorbing that. And even like, if you you can enculturate your children into a very relativistic worldview that says we should never tell anyone they're wrong and all opinions are equally valid. And it is actually bad to have an opinion on something and be dogmatic. But you have enculturated your child into that perspective. It's not that you have given them a neutral perspective. You have told them that your value is not being dogmatic. And so I think that the parents who are like, oh, Christians are bad because they're indoctrinating their children. It's like, no, they're enculturating their children into their community. And if you don't like their community, well, then that's your own prejudice that is speaking. And what you're really saying is, I would enculturate those children better.
So you would just want to, just so I can understand you better. So you would say, I mean, just the way I look at it is that there's different levels to indoctrination, or like, you know, how you talk to your children. So you can be like, hey, if you don't believe this, you're a bad person. And that's like, you know, maybe super high indoctrination, or something like, you know, communication. And, you know, if you're telling your child, you know, both sides of the debate, like, obviously you have a preference. So like, you're kind of going to end up communicating your bias. And then of course you have, you know, children are heavily influenced, you know, they want to be accepted, they want to be loved. So oftentimes they'll choose the idea that, you know, fits best with their parents. So there can be a influencing there. But you'd say that, like, you know, there's no way to get rid of any of that.
Well, I think the idea that children believe something because we told them, like, is probably not accurate. I don't think that's how our worldviews are formed. I think we we believe what comports with our reality. So we model for our children behavior and values and narratives that explain reality, and they absorb and repeat, and to, like, as they grow, like, accept or reject those values and narratives. But I don't think anyone believes Jesus died on the cross for your sin just because they were told that was true. Like, at some point, there's an experiential response to that truth. There's an encounter with God that, in their experience, this is their reality that they now accept. So I think we maybe get hung up on, like, ideas kids are exposed to, but I think the ideas we internalize are not necessarily like what our teachers told us was true, what our parents have told us was true. They're what we've experienced as true and what, like, makes sense of our reality. So I think if parents want the Christian narrative of reality to make sense, then what's most important is that their lives demonstrate that reality. So I think when I've been like, how do I communicate my faith to my kids? It's more been, how do I provide experiences for them where they see God working and they encounter God for themselves, and they, like, see that I love God and I love people and I am serving and I am giving them opportunities to serve and have that chance to, like, say, okay, whatever I'm telling you is true. Like, can you see it? Can you feel it? Is it true for you too? Because I think that's where they, like, own it. I don't think any child believes something just because their parents tell them, like, past a certain point, like, at some point, Santa Claus is a lie because he's, like, it doesn't comport with your experience. So I think that relates to our, like, the doctrines we're trying to teach our kids too. At some point, it's going to either make sense of their reality and their experiences, or it's not.
Yeah. Something we also talked about over Messenger is that you talked about how, like, you communicate, like, that you talk about, like, bias and how those types of things can affect how we see the world, and, like, how we should I guess teach children about that type of topic. Like, can you go into detail about that?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of our Christian curriculum has been very focused on answers. So we want our children to have the right answers. We want them to be able to give an answer for the faith they profess. We want them to have good arguments. And I think sometimes then, like, the focus becomes just on the answer, not the way we got to the answer. So I want my kids to understand what I believe, and I'm happy to share with them the conclusions that I've drawn. But I think it's more important for them to understand the process of how I arrived at my belief, and to have a process for evaluating other people's conclusions. So, like, in the information age, one of the hugest problems now in education is people can't evaluate a source. And so I want my kids to be able to hear a claim and ask questions about, well, like, who's saying this? And do they have any expertise? And are they, like, if it's a representative, a lawyer working for an oil company talking about climate change, are they the person whose opinion we trust most on, climatology data? Or should we, believe a climatologist who's saying something different? And, is there a difference between TMZ and NPR? Yes, there is. And so I want them to be able to evaluate sources of information for credibility, and we need to know who to trust. And as Christians, it can't be as simple as, like, well, we trust other Christians who act and think like we do. Like, we should value knowledge and expertise and not just be tribal about it. And so I think one cognitive bias is in-group thinking that, like, well, the people in my group that I most identify with have to be right. And I would like my kids to be able to evaluate and say, no, just because a Christian says something and we like Christians doesn't mean that they are basing their conclusions on good arguments or on real facts. Like, we need to evaluate things, and we need to just be aware of when we're likely to trust people or not trust people based on who they are and our own prejudices, and when we are maybe not thinking something through because it triggers us in some way. And the really like critical, thoughtful thing to do would be to say, okay, what are my own biases are making me not give this a fair hearing? So we, like, my kids are teenagers right now. They're 8th grade, freshmen and a junior in high school. And I think that they have absorbed many of my viewpoints in life just because I'm such a convincing person, obviously. But I've also appreciated, like, in their interactions, they take classes online, how they're able to evaluate claims other people make. And one of the questions asked, like, well, where did you get that information? And who are you believing it? And they don't just immediately accept something because a teacher said it or because a Christian peer who they like said it. So I think that's a success.
Right. Yeah. I kind of liken it to the idea where it's like you don't want, you know, you don't want other parents, or you don't even want yourself to be teaching like super crazy things that are wrong. And if we say, hey, be open-minded to all views, then you come across the idea of like, oh, well, something like flat Earth, like.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what do you want to teach children, like every pro and con of flat earthism or whatever? Like,
Right. Some
there has
ideas
to be.
shouldn't be entertained. They should be immediately dismissed as stupid. And yeah, I think maybe in our society, we have kind of veered too much in the other direction, is everyone deserves to be heard. And it's like, no, not on every topic. Everyone deserves to be like loved and treated as a, human with dignity, but not everyone's ideas are good. Like, some of them are garbage. So yeah, my kids have probably absorbed that, like, most people are stupid mentality, which is probably not good. But the other thing, I when it comes to Christian views, I want my kids to be aware that, like, Christians are not a monolithic. Like, we don't all believe the same thing. You have different denominations. You have different cultures that are contextualizing Christianity in different ways. And I want them, like, there are essentials, I think, like Jesus is Lord and his kingdom is coming. Like, we all agree on that. But there are, Bible passages that are on the fringes there are different interpretations, and there are applications that differ. So when we're like, well, how do we apply what the Bible says to gay marriage? Well, Christians don't agree. Like, and it's not that, well, some Christians accept the Bible and some Christians don't. It's that, no, Christians are interpreting the Bible differently. And not only that, they're applying their Bible interpretations differently. And so we need to be able to evaluate the whole process of going to the Bible for truth. How do we interpret it? How do we understand the difference between the culture that it was given in and the ways that truth was contextualized for them? How do we know what's timeless and what applies to us? And then, like, even if we have like a true thing, we still have to apply it to our world. And those answers aren't clear all the time. And I would like my kids to have some tolerance for ambiguity and for the idea that depending on how you prioritize different values and you prioritize different doctrines, even, you're going to come out in different places. And that doesn't mean like one person's got a Christian view and one person doesn't have a Christian view. It just means there's diversity in the church. And like, I have to think that in some ways God must like this. He must like the idea that like churches in different places and people in different times and like have gotten very different messages, because it's like it keeps happening. And like people are being fruitful Christians in their lives, even with very, like, you can be a pacifist and be a very fruitful Christian, and you can be led by God to your pacifism. And you can be like a colonel in the army and be led by God to be like a godly leader in a human institution. And I think like you can both be like on God's path for your life, and you can both be applying, Christian values, but you're coming out in very different places. And so I'd like my kids to be able to not just accept that, but kind of empathize with how people get to where they are, and just accept that, God's leading people different ways. People can prioritize, one thing over another and end up in a different place, but that doesn't mean they're prioritizing something wrong or bad. It just, like, life is very messy and complicated, and we don't always have black and white answers.
Yeah, of course. So you briefly mentioned how, like, you know, some views are stupid and we can, disregard those. Um, but I guess my question is, like, how do we evaluate whether a view is stupid? Is it just like, scientists? Well, I mean, obviously, like, just because a lot of people believe it doesn't mean it's false. Like, how do we differentiate those ideas?
Yeah, I think, well, and in this day and age, it's hard because people don't trust, like, there's such a lack of trust of sources. So
Hmm.
I think I start with the idea that like experts are trustworthy. So if you have a PhD in geology and you have worked with fossils for 20 years, like you probably know what you're talking about. You probably know more than I do. And so I'm going to trust that expertise. Now, I think in our church, there's this, like the Christian church in America, there's this very unhealthy distrust of expertise. And it's like characterized as elitism, or, oh, so you have to like spend 20 years just to know something. It's like, sometimes, yeah, you do. And so like, so the idea that like an actual medical doctor who's been practicing for 30 years knows more than like your chiropractor who got his license online, like that's a real thing. And but I think that teaching students who's trustworthy a lot of times comes down to our values and like what we like our epistemology, like what we believe is sound knowledge and how you get it. So I think some Christians, their epistemology is very much like, well, my interpretation of the Bible is my source of knowledge. And I think they think they're putting like their faith in the Bible, but it's really their understanding that they're counting on, and not so that there's less of a chance for other like areas of expertise to speak into like what counts as true. And I think that's unfortunate.
So, a last question on that topic here. So you mentioned how, like, yeah, you kind of have like a basis of, okay, we're going to trust the science. Like, the experts are going to be right typically. I mean, obviously, you're not going to be dogmatic about it. Like, one expert's always going to be right if they have a lot of expertise on the subject. Obviously, there's dissenters and, like, controversial views where scientists don't always agree on the topic. But so I guess, could you talk about like what exactly, like, I guess, why is it so improbable to just say, hey, all science is wrong, or the scientists are wrong? Is it just like the probability of, one, like, a whole bunch of different people that are experts being wrong at the same time? I mean, obviously that's happened in the past. So, like, what are you using to evaluate that?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a legitimate it's a legitimate point that science, science meaning the body of knowledge that we consider true, is changing and being tweaked and evaluated and reimagined as we get new ways of testing things, as we, understand more about DNA or gravitational waves or whatever. Like, as we get more knowledge, our models are being adapted to fit the new knowledge. But I think sometimes Christians take that and they're like, so maybe the evolutionary model or the Big Bang model like will be thrown away. And that to me requires conspiratorial thinking that like for 100 years, scientists all over the world are completely deluded and terrible at their job because none of them have realized that the basis of their research that is making perfect sense of everything is garbage and doesn't make sense. And that to me is like, who thinks that way? That's delusional. It's delusional to think that so many people with so many years of study, so many like, hours of exploration saying this fits and this works, that they're completely wrong. Now, I believe like things will be changed and adapted, but they're on the fringes and on the edges of what we know, not like in the center. And I think like a good thing to bring up to kids is like our faith changes over time and gets adapted to our new knowledge. So like I went to Wheaton College and in like the 50s, as a student, you couldn't go see movies because it was considered a violation of the verse. Like it wasn't considered seemly for Christians. Like it was going to damage your reputation as a Christian if you were seen going to a movie. And so they were basing this prohibition on like an actual interpretation of Bible, like, you know, like let your reputation among people be without, you know, be above reproach. And so they're like, so you can't go to movies. But like the context changed, and we, you know, gained a different understanding maybe of what that means. And so now, like, college students can go to movies. It's not a big deal. And you have, you know, little things like that is more like how we put into practice our Christianity. But you have different understandings of, you know, like the abolitionist movement brought a different understanding of like the image of God in Africans and that kind of thing. Like it was a major theological ideas that were challenged, and were sort of, the church moved and adapted. And so I think when you understand that both in the church, what we believe, and scientists, nobody's just like, I have an argument and I am making it and the best argument wins. Like everyone's functioning in a community with a history and with a way of doing things. And they, in order to change something, you have to get a lot of people agreeing that something needs to be changed, or like new information matters and needs to be evaluated. It's never just like one person has a good argument and so we decide to go with that guy. You have to convince your peers. And so I think that understanding how peer review works and how just like consensus works, both in the science and consensus works in church too. We don't just like, you know, if you're a guy who's like, the Bible says this and you should believe me, like you start a cult. Like you have to hold up your Bible interpretations to church history and the way your particular Christian community has understood it. And if you want to propose something new, like you have to like duke it out with everyone and get people to think that it's, you know, there's merit in changing the way we thought about it. So I think when you kind of help kids understand how we arrive at consensus, it's more than just like, well, if you do the scientific method, everyone can get a good answer. Well, maybe not necessarily. You still have to convince your peers that it's a good answer, and you have to demonstrate it with proof.
Yeah, so we kind of talked about how, you know, some children are, you know, more easily influenceable. A lot of children actually. And of course, you know, we're all influenceable in a certain degree, but of course, a lot of Christians will say, like, you know, the topic of Christianity, heaven and hell, it's very, very, very important. Like this is eternity we're talking about, and that Christian parents feel like they're doing a bad job if they don't communicate to their children what's right. Like almost like some would even say that, you know, we should brainwash our children if it's right, because that's what will be best for them in the long run. Like, what do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I think it goes to an understanding of Christianity and faith that is basically about mental assent to propositions, which I think is like a very modernist Western idea of what Christianity is. And it's not like the global church, and it's not like the historical church that like, if you just mentally assent to the right propositions, you're saved. So my first thing would be like, I don't think you have a Christian kid because you've gotten them to recite the right stuff. So because our relationship with God is an internal spiritual orientation that involves our like whole being, our will and our mind and our heart and our emotions, everything. And so one thing that working on the BioLogos Forum as a moderator, I see a lot of college kids who have been very well indoctrinated into the right answers. And they're in the middle of like a really devastating crisis of faith as young adults, because some proposition that they had mentally assented to has been challenged in a significant way, usually by YouTube. And they don't have a relationship with God to fall back on, or an experience as like a Christian, living a Christian life with Christian feelings and virtue and experience. They just have the mental list of, this is what makes me a Christian, is I believe this, I believe this, I believe this, I believe this. And so I think, number one, it's problematic if parents think that getting their kids to repeat the things means they've raised Christian children. I don't think that's the kind of faith that lasts when there's adversity, when there's doubt, when there's struggle. So I think for me, yes, I'm going to tell my kids what I believe, and I'm going to tell them what I think. I'm going to bring them to church so they can be catechized into what the church believes, and I'm going to expose them to Christian community, and we're all going to agree this is what we think is true. But I think it's more important that they kind of be initiated into a life that's Christian, and they see people who have been transformed by God's Spirit, who are like displaying the fruit of the Spirit in life, who are responding Christianly to the world, because those are the experiences that are going to hold when a particular belief is challenged. There was a psychologist I was listening to interviewed, and he said this thing, and I love it. I keep coming back to it. He said, it's not what we believe that changes us, it's what we love. And so I think that parents, our most important thing to teach our kids is what to love. And, you know, we love God and we love people and we respond to God's love for us. And we like point out examples of his grace and we point out examples of his power. And we love that. And that is what changes us and allows us to mentally like assent to the beliefs. So yeah, I don't like when I think of, if you're just getting kids to parrot beliefs, that's not a lasting faith. That's programming them. And so I would rather my kids not have answers on certain things and be willing, but have like the spiritual equipment and the relationship with God to work through their questions and evaluate their experiences in light of like who they know God is, than, you know, to have the approved list of answers to all the questions that we can come up with memorized and ready to go.
Yeah, no, that really changes our approach to parenting in general. And, you know, teaching, like, just because you have the right belief doesn't make you, you know, a Christ follower or I mean, you even have a relationship with God in that way. So a little bit of a change of the topic. Yeah, obviously, as you're a parent, or, you know, you're looking to get what type of curriculum or homeschooling or private schooling or whatever, a difficult challenge in, you know, teaching of children is like, you know, just the way the brain grows and, you know, our capacity to learn. Like, how does your parenting and your curriculum adapt to that in regards to like what you teach your children at different ages?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think like a lot of people I talk to, they grew up with a certain way of being taught and they don't want to repeat it with their children, but they kind of are picturing themselves and what they know now and all the baggage that they've unpacked. And they want to, you know, explain it to their 5-year-old. It's like their 5-year-old doesn't need to know about like archetypal Adam. That this is not helpful. And so I think we do need to keep in mind that children are very concrete thinkers. They respond to affection and they have like basic needs like feeling secure and loved and accepted. And so when I'm talking about God and the Bible, what I want to bring out to them is that they're God's child, that he's going to protect them, that God loves us, that he loves it when we thank him, that he loves us when we worship him. So when I read Genesis with a child, I'm not going to talk about how it fits with the evolutionary model or when in human history Adam and Eve existed, if they did exist, and when humanity became God's image bearers. Like that's completely irrelevant to a child's understanding of the world. They need to know, isn't it amazing? God made fish. Like we love watching fish swim. Fish are great creatures. Let's watch a documentary about fish and talk about how amazing it is that God created fish. And that's kind of like the level they're on. And so like when my children were young, as far as like creation, I wanted them to internalize that God is an amazing creator, the world inspires wonder and awe, and that our response to the wonder and awe we feel is to worship God who created it, and to like know that he loves us and we're special. And even though we can look at the whole starry sky full of, other galaxies, that like God loves us, and isn't that amazing? And that he hears our prayers, and that he, takes care of us and gives us what we need. And that sense of like security in relationship with God, and like being like a part of creation that matters to God, I think is what you want to communicate to young children. And so I just taught the Bible like what I thought like inspires me. Like I would say, this is when I read this part of the Bible, this is what is amazing to me about it. And then when we did science class, I just said, this is what scientists think. And if maybe there was a disconnect that I thought they might have, like most of the time they didn't even notice it. And they were not asking, well, so we're studying, prehistoric, Homo naledi discovery, like how does that relate to Adam and Eve? Like just didn't ask those questions. And so it wasn't until like much later when they're able to make, it's not till junior high and high school that kids start engaging in more abstract thinking and sort of trying to understand how things fit. And so I think you answer the questions when they come up, and then it's like, yeah, like some Christians see it this way, some Christians see it this way. This is the thing I find most compelling. These are the places I still have questions. My kids know I still have a lot of unresolved questions, and like it's fine. We can still like love God and love people and be out in the world, serving him, even if we don't know exactly, the answer to this, or how to, what to do with this Bible passage. So.
Yeah, that reminded me of how, so I interviewed Joel Anderson on the topic of, is Genesis a myth? And he was just talking about how, he went to school, Bible college, all this other stuff. And then he started teaching, and he wasn't even an evolutionist at the time. And he was like, wait, there's a controversy here? Like, what?
Mm-hmm.
Did I just miss out on a lot? Like, what's going on here? And he just like didn't see the controversy, and then all of a sudden, a bunch of fundamental Christians are like, oh, there's definitely a controversy. Like, you're a bad person. Like, wait, what? How did that happen? I don't even know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And
well, I think too, like a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to lie to my children, so I don't want to present Genesis in a way that's like too concrete, because I want them to know, it's like 5-year-olds think Dora the Explorer is real. Like, it's fine. They're just, that's how they're approaching the world, is they're not making all of these categories between like myth and history and fiction and nonfiction. Like, and they know like things that are made up and things that are true. But when it comes to like a story, it's always real to them. And so it's like, it's fine to say, we're going to read these stories in the Bible. And it's fine if it's like real to them, because that's how they interact with stories. And yeah, like later on when they start processing this, wondering about, well, how does this fit with this other thing? Then you can talk about it.
Yeah. Could you talk about, so you mentioned like kind of how about like, you mentioned like, younger ages. Does your curriculum and just how you teach your children, does that change? Like at what age do you, have you started to, I guess, teach your children differently?
Yeah, well, the curriculum we wrote is for high school, and
Okay.
there are certain units that could be adapted down to junior high, or like adapted up to college. Like it's designed to be flexible, but we sort of aimed it at like freshman, sophomore in high school. Mm-hmm. And the reason it's aimed that way is because like a lot of the more interesting ethical and theological and philosophical things require a certain ability to think abstractly and to evaluate different perspectives, and young elementary school children just aren't there yet. So what I did as a parent, what I recommend to other parents, is there's so many quality science materials available, written by science writers for children in very accessible ways. And so like we read science books in science class, and we watched National Geographic documentaries. And I don't think we need to have every input in our life have like Bible verses infused onto it so we know we can accept it. Like, I think it's fine to teach our children, like, we accept what John Attenborough says about, the deep sea, because he's a scientist and he's doing this interesting program. And then like Bible, we kind of talked about like, well, who Jesus is. And we focused more on, how do we act Christianly when we, see somebody who needs something? Very concrete things, like what does it mean concretely to be a Christ follower? And I don't think that like when you talk about like the evolution creationism debate, or the the ancient Near East worldview and how it affects our interpretation of Genesis, most of the stuff is not stuff that young children are interested in. It comes up in junior high, middle school, and high school when they're starting to process, number one, that other people think differently than them. So there's a great book called Science Geek Sam and His Secret Logbook that it was written by a Dutch man. His last name is Decker, I think. And it's about a middle schooler whose uncle is a scientist, but he goes to this Christian school. And so he brings in his uncle to give this guest talk. And I don't know, there's like an asteroid that hits their school or something. And this chaos breaks out because the scientist uncle like says stuff that not all the Christian kids in the class think is right. And so the teacher like embarks on this like idea to explore, what do Christians think about this different thing? But it really just emphasizes that not all Christians see science and how we should respond to it the same way. It's okay. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to have uncles who are scientists. It's okay to be the kid in your class that doesn't have the same view as some of the other kids, but like to also understand, they're doing the best they can, trying to make sense of the world. And so I think like my kids, that's where they were at in junior high. In middle school was, okay, here's what we've kind of learned and what we sort of accept in our family, but we have all these friends, sometimes teachers who are coming from this other perspective. So what's that about? And how did they get where they are? And so I spent some time kind of talking about, well, this is how your friends are interpreting this Bible passage, and this is what they're valuing. And like, we can respect that and we can empathize with them, even if we don't draw the same conclusions.
Yeah, great answer. I like that a lot. Okay, so that's really all I have for you today. I really appreciate you coming on, Christy. Is there, and you have your Facebook, you have a BioLogos site. Could you tell everyone the link and other ways to contact you?
Yeah, the link to the Integrate curriculum is biologos.org/integrate. And you can, from the biologos.org website, click on the forum, and there's just a discussion forum that I participate in regularly with some other people who are interested in just talking about science, faith, how, we don't always stick to those topics. Other things get brought up that have to do with like Bible interpretation, or, how do we live Christianly today. And there's also a special part of the forum that's dedicated to educators. So if you're a parent or a Christian school teacher and you'd like to sort of commiserate with other parents or teachers kind of coming from this perspective of trying to harmonize mainstream science and a Christian perspective, we welcome your participation. You can just share what things are like in your community, the challenges you're having. We'd be happy to interact with you there. And yeah, I'm always happy to meet new people and talk about kids and homeschooling and science and the Bible, my favorite topics.
Awesome. Well, once again, appreciate you having coming on. I thought this was really good. I think this is going to help a lot of people. Thanks again, Christy. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thank you so much, Zach, for having me.
Yeah, of course.